Richard Whitman believed he was the most important person on this flight. A wealthy, arrogant CEO, he was used to people catering to him, used to getting exactly what he wanted, when he wanted it. So, when he boarded first class and saw a black woman sitting comfortably in a premium seat, his ego flared. He didn't recognize her. He didn't care to. To him, she didn't belong. With a cocky smirk and condescending tone, he humiliated her in front of the entire cabin, mocking her presence, questioning her status, and making it clear he saw her as less than. But what Richard didn't know, she was his new boss. And before this flight landed, he was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. Have you ever witnessed someone's ego get the best of them? Tell us in the comments. And if you love stories about justice and karma, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because today, arrogance meets consequences. Richard Whitman adjusted the cufflinks on his expensive suit, his signature smug expression plastered across his face as he stepped onto the first-class cabin. Everything about him screamed power. The confidence in his walk, the way he barely acknowledged the flight attendants, the subtle but unmistakable air of superiority. This was a man who believed the world revolved around him. He was a self-made billionaire. Or so he liked to remind people. CEO of Whitman Financial, a powerful investment firm, he had built his empire on ruthless ambition and an unshakable belief that money determined a person's worth. And today, he was flying first class to finalize a major business deal. His company had recently merged with another firm, and he was set to meet the new leadership. But for now, all he wanted was a smooth, luxurious flight. Then he saw her, seated in 3A, legs crossed elegantly. A black woman in a sleek navy business suit sat with a calm, composed expression, scrolling through something on her tablet. Richard's smirk twitched. Something about the sight irritated him. He couldn't explain why, but there was something about the way she sat so confidently, the way she seemed completely at ease in first class. He brushed off the feeling, heading toward his own seat just a few rows behind her. But as he settled in, his irritation only grew. She wasn't dressed like someone trying to show off wealth. She wasn't glancing around nervously like she was new to this environment. She wasn't even trying to acknowledge him. She was just there, unbothered, comfortable, as if she belonged. Richard couldn't stand it. Olivia Carter, 45 years old, powerful yet effortlessly composed. She had just been promoted to CEO of Carter and Associates, the firm that had merged with Whitman Financial. The official announcement had yet to be made, so Richard had no idea who she was. And Olivia? She wasn't going to tell him. She had spent her career dealing with men like Richard, the type who judged people by their appearance, their gender, their background, the type who believed power was about dominance, not intelligence. She had built her success brick by brick, overcoming every barrier the corporate world threw at her. And today, she was flying first class not because she had to, but because she had earned it. She sensed Richard's irritation immediately. The way he kept glancing at her, the slight frown, the barely concealed look of disapproval. She had seen it all before. Instead of reacting, she simply adjusted her glasses and kept reading. Meanwhile, Richard's discomfort was growing. He kept checking his watch, sighing loudly, trying to make his presence known. And the flight hadn't even taken off yet. A flight attendant approached Olivia with a warm smile. "Miss Carter, would you like a drink before takeoff?" Richard's head snapped up. Miss Carter. She wasn't just some random passenger. But before he could dwell on it, Olivia gave a polite smile. "Water is fine, thank you." As the flight attendant walked away, Richard's jaw tightened. There was something off about this. He didn't know why, but he suddenly felt an overwhelming need to put her in her place, and before this flight was over, he would make sure she knew exactly who he was. What Richard didn't know. She already knew exactly who he was. And soon, his arrogance would cost him everything. Richard Whitman sat stiffly in his seat, his fingers drumming impatiently against the armrest. He kept stealing glances at Olivia Carter, still seated in 3A, still calm, still composed, still infuriatingly unbothered. Something about the way she occupied the space with confidence, without trying, without needing to prove herself, made his blood boil. Richard had spent years building his wealth, his reputation, his dominance. He had learned that power was about making sure people knew their place. And yet, here was this woman, acting like she had every right to be here. He was done, pretending she didn't bother him. The moment the flight crew announced that passengers could move around freely, Richard stood up. With his most practiced, charming smile, he casually made his way up the aisle and stopped right next to Olivia's seat. She didn't look up. That annoyed him even more. Clearing his throat dramatically, Richard leaned in slightly. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. Olivia slowly looked up from her tablet. "Yes?" Richard tilted his head, giving her an exaggerated once-over. "I just wanted to make sure you knew this was first class." A small silence followed. Olivia blinked. Then slowly she closed her tablet, giving him her full attention. "I'm aware," she said simply. Richard gave a low chuckle, shaking his head. Of course. It's just, you don't exactly look like the typical first-class flyer." A few passengers turned their heads slightly, sensing the tension. Olivia arched an eyebrow. "Oh? And what do first-class flyers look like?" Richard smirked, gesturing around at the mostly white, older businessmen in the cabin. "You know, the usual crowd. High-powered executives, company owners, people who actually run things." Olivia let his words hang in the air. Then she smiled. Richard felt a small pang of unease. Why wasn't she reacting the way he expected? Richard doubled down, determined to get a reaction. "I'm just saying," he continued, feigning concern. "I hope you didn't get scammed into paying extra for this seat. Happens all the time. You know how these airlines are, always trying to squeeze more money out of people who don't really understand the system." This time, a few passengers audibly scoffed. Some shook their heads. One businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper, watching intently. But Richard? He was too busy enjoying himself to notice. "I'd hate for you to waste your money," he added, grinning as if he was doing her a favor. Olivia's expression remained unreadable. Then she spoke. "Well," she said, her voice calm and measured, "if I was wasting my money, I'm sure someone would have told me by now." Richard chuckled again, shaking his head. "I guess we'll find out, won't we?" At this point, the energy in the cabin had shifted. More passengers were now watching the exchange. A flight attendant had paused nearby, looking uneasy. The businessman across the aisle leaned forward slightly, shaking his head. Richard was too caught up in himself to notice. "So, what do you do?" Richard pressed, smirking as if he already knew the answer. "I'm curious." Olivia tilted her head slightly. "You seem very interested in me," she said. A few soft chuckles came from nearby passengers. Richard's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected her to flip it on him. "I'm just making conversation," he said quickly, forcing a grin. Olivia held his gaze for a moment longer, then smiled politely. "I work in finance," she said. Richard let out a laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, that's cute," he said. "What, you're a financial advisor? Or do you work in HR? Maybe a junior analyst?" A visible reaction rippled through the surrounding passengers. A few people exchanged looks. Some shook their heads. Richard still didn't notice. Olivia, however, did. She simply leaned back in her seat, studying Richard like a puzzle she had already solved. At this point, the flight attendant finally stepped forward. "Sir," she said cautiously, "perhaps you should return to your seat." Richard rolled his eyes. "Relax, I'm just having a conversation." Then he turned back to Olivia. "But I'll tell you what," he said, crossing his arms. "I run one of the most powerful financial firms in the country. Maybe, if you're looking for a job, I can put in a good word for you." A few audible gasps. Richard finally noticed the expressions around him. Something felt off. The businessman across the aisle let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. The flight attendant looked nervous. And Olivia, she just smiled. Richard suddenly felt uneasy. Why did it feel like he was missing something? Then Olivia finally spoke. "You should check your company emails," she said, still smiling. Richard frowned. "Why?" Her smile widened. "Because," she said smoothly, "I just became your new boss." Richard froze. For the first time all flight, he was speechless. Passengers watched with amused expressions. The flight attendant took a small step back, sensing what was about to unfold. And Olivia? She just picked up her tablet, calmly reopening it. "Enjoy your flight, Richard," she said, turning back to her screen. Richard's face turned ghost white, and in that moment, he knew his career had just taken off in the worst possible way. Richard Whitman's face drained of color. His mind raced, his usual confidence crumbling, as Olivia Carter's words echoed in his head. "I just became your new boss." The businessman across the aisle smirked, shaking his head in amusement. The flight attendant took a cautious step back, sensing the tension. Passengers watched intently, waiting to see Richard's next move. For the first time in a long time, he had no idea what to say. Olivia, however, remained perfectly calm. She had seen this moment play out in her head from the very beginning. Still, she gave Richard a chance. He could either accept his mistake gracefully, or he could dig himself an even deeper hole. Richard chose the latter. Richard let out a forced chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh, that's a good one," he said, though his voice lacked the arrogance from before. "You almost had me there." He pulled out his phone, quickly opening his emails. His fingers trembled slightly as he scrolled, and then he saw it, the official merger announcement. Carter and Associates and Whitman Financial were now one company, and leading the firm, CEO Olivia Carter. Richard's stomach dropped. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. This wasn't a joke. This was real. He had just humiliated the very woman who controlled his future. Richard looked up quickly, forcing another smile. "Miss Carter, I had no idea." Olivia simply arched an eyebrow. "Didn't you?" Richard swallowed hard. "I mean, of course, I knew about the merger, but I hadn't seen the final leadership decision yet." Olivia closed her tablet, slowly tilting her head. "So, tell me, Richard," she said smoothly, "when you assumed I didn't belong here, when you suggested I might have been scammed into first class, was that just a habit? Or was it specific to me?" A few passengers chuckled quietly. Richard's face turned red. I didn't mean any offense," he stammered. Olivia held his gaze. She wasn't letting him off that easy. "Oh, but you did," she said. "You meant every word." For the first time in his life, Richard felt completely powerless. His usual arrogance, his dominance, his ability to control a room, none of it worked here. Because now, the room belonged to Olivia, and Richard was just a spectator. The businessman across the aisle chuckled again, leaning back in his seat. "This is better than an in-flight movie," he muttered under his breath. The flight attendant struggled to maintain her professionalism. Passengers who had once ignored Richard's behavior were now openly enjoying his downfall. And Richard, he knew he had lost. Richard let out a nervous laugh, adjusting his tie. "Look," he said, his voice shaky, "this is obviously a misunderstanding. I may have come across a little strong." "A little strong," Olivia repeated, tilting her head. Richard cleared his throat. "What I meant to say is that I hold the highest respect for leadership. And now that I know who you are, I just want to say, welcome to the company." A few passengers scoffed. Even the flight attendant bit her lip, trying not to laugh. Olivia let the silence stretch. Then she leaned forward slightly, resting her elbow on the armrest. "Richard," she said, "do you really think this is about who I am?" Richard blinked. "Well, it's not," she continued. "It's about who you are." Richard's stomach tightened. "Let's say I wasn't the CEO," Olivia went on. "Let's say I was just another first-class passenger. Would you have treated me any differently?" Richard's jaw clenched, because they both knew the answer. Number he wouldn't have. He would have continued his insults, his arrogance, his condescension. Because in his mind, he was always the most powerful person in the room. Until today. Olivia sat back, letting out a slow breath. Then she spoke the words that sealed Richard's fate. "This was supposed to be our first professional meeting," she said, "and you just gave me every reason to reconsider keeping you at this company." Richard's blood ran cold. Passengers murmured. The businessman across the aisle whistled lowly. The flight attendant took a step back. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. Because he knew, he had no defense. Olivia picked up her tablet again, calmly reopening her document. "Enjoy the rest of the flight, Richard," she said, returning to her work. Richard stood frozen in the aisle, completely humiliated. For the first time in his life, he had no control. And for the first time ever, he was the one who didn't belong. Richard Whitman remained frozen in the aisle, his face pale and tense as Olivia Carter casually returned to her work. The power dynamic had shifted so drastically that he could barely process it. Passengers were still whispering, exchanging glances. Some were openly amused. Others looked at Richard with undisguised satisfaction. But the worst part, the realization that his future was now uncertain. For years, Richard had believed he was untouchable. He had ruled his company with an iron fist, intimidating employees, belittling competitors, and crushing anyone who challenged his authority. But now, he had finally met someone more powerful than him, and he had insulted her. Richard forced himself to move, slowly returning to his seat. His mind raced, trying to calculate the damage. There had to be a way out of this. Maybe he could fix it. Maybe if he sent an email, no, too formal. Maybe he could call one of the board members. No, that would make him look weak. Maybe his phone buzzed. A new email notification flashed across the screen. Subject: Emergency Board Meeting. Scheduled. Richard's stomach twisted. He opened the email with shaky hands. Board members will convene immediately after the flight lands to discuss leadership changes and new CEO oversight. His breath hitched. Leadership changes? New CEO oversight? This was worse than he thought. Meanwhile, the businessman across the aisle let out a low chuckle. "Well, that took a turn," he muttered. Richard shot him a glare, but he didn't respond. He couldn't, because for the first time in his entire career, he had lost control of the narrative. The flight attendant, who had watched the entire exchange earlier, now approached Olivia with a warm smile. "Miss Carter," she said politely, "we have an executive lounge reserved for you upon landing. Would you like anything special prepared?" Richard flinched. Even the flight crew knew who she was, and they were treating her with the respect he had once demanded for himself. Olivia glanced up, smiling politely. "No special requests. Just doing your job well is enough." The flight attendant nodded respectfully. Richard, on the other hand, felt completely invisible. He had spent his entire career making people feel small, and now he was the one shrinking. As the flight continued, Richard sat silently staring at his reflection in the darkened window. Was this how people felt when he humiliated them? Had he been so blind to his own arrogance that he never realized the weight of his words? Or had he always known, but never cared? Either way, it didn't matter now. Because for the first time in his life, his words had consequences. And when this plane landed, everything would change. Richard Whitman sat motionless, staring at his reflection in the airplane window. His mind was racing, but for the first time in years, he had no solution, no way to fix what he had done. How had this happened? Just a few hours ago, he was on top of the world, confident, untouchable, certain of his power. Now, his future was hanging by a thread. As the captain announced the plane's descent, Richard felt a new kind of anxiety settle over him. Whatever happened next was out of his hands. The moment the plane touched down, Richard's phone buzzed again. New email, board meeting, urgent, CEO review and leadership decisions. Oh, Richard's stomach churned. This wasn't just a routine meeting. This was about him. As passengers began to gather their belongings, Olivia Carter remained calm and composed, closing her tablet before standing up. A few people glanced her way with admiration. They had seen the way she handled Richard. They had witnessed true leadership. Richard, on the other hand, hesitated. For the first time, he didn't rush to be first off the plane. He was stalling. As Olivia stepped into the terminal, an airline representative was already waiting to escort her to the executive lounge. "Miss Carter," the woman said, her voice full of respect, "your car is ready whenever you are." Richard, just a few feet behind her, heard everything. His jaw tightened. A flight attendant passed by him, giving him a knowing look before continuing her duties. Passengers who had witnessed the confrontation whispered amongst themselves. And Richard? He had never felt smaller. An hour later, Richard entered the sleek boardroom of Whitman Financial. The tension was thick. The entire executive team was already seated, waiting. And at the head of the table, Olivia Carter. Richard took a deep breath, trying to summon his usual confidence. But something about her presence, her calm authority, the way she watched him without saying a word, it rattled him. He sat down, trying to appear collected, but his hands were sweating. One of the board members, an older man who had once been Richard's biggest supporter, cleared his throat. "Richard, we need to discuss your behavior, both in the office and, more recently, on a certain flight." Richard swallowed hard. There it was. His arrogance, his entitlement, his blatant disregard for others. It had finally caught up with him. The entire room was silent, waiting for him to respond. He could lie, he could make excuses, or he could own it. Richard took a deep breath, then did something he had never done before. He spoke honestly. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I assumed things about someone I didn't know. I let my ego make decisions for me. And I was wrong." The room remained silent. Olivia studied him carefully. Richard felt the weight of the moment. "I spent my career believing power meant being the loudest person in the room," he admitted. "But real power? Real leadership?" He finally met Olivia's gaze. "It looks like you." A few board members exchanged surprised glances. Even Olivia raised an eyebrow slightly. For the first time, Richard Whitman was actually listening. Olivia leaned forward, her voice measured and firm. "Richard, this company is bigger than any one person's ego. Leadership isn't about intimidation or proving your status. It's about making others feel valued, respected, and heard." Richard nodded slowly. He finally understood. "Here's what's going to happen," Olivia continued. "You're being placed on probation. Effective immediately, you'll be stepping down from key decision-making roles." Richard felt his heart drop, but he didn't argue. "In the meantime, you will undergo executive training, leadership development, and diversity education," Olivia added. Richard exhaled. "And if I refuse, then you're done here." Silence. Then Richard nodded. He wasn't used to being held accountable. But maybe it was time he finally learned. As the meeting concluded, Richard walked out of the boardroom feeling something unfamiliar. Not anger, not frustration. Something close to relief. For the first time in his life, he'd been forced to look in the mirror. And, for the first time, he actually wanted to change. Meanwhile, Olivia Carter sat back in her chair, watching him leave. This was why she had fought so hard to get where she was. Not just to lead, but to change the culture. And today, she had taken the first step toward doing exactly that. As Richard Whitman stepped out of the boardroom, the weight of the conversation still lingered in his chest. For years, he had believed power came from dominance, from being feared and respected. But today, he had learned that true leadership wasn't about intimidation. It was about integrity. He wasn't sure if he could fully change, but for the first time in his life, he wanted to try. Meanwhile, Olivia Carter sat back in her chair, watching him leave. She knew change wouldn't happen overnight. People like Richard didn't transform in a single moment, but she had planted the seed. And sometimes, that was enough to start something bigger. Have you ever been in a situation where someone judged you unfairly? How did you handle it? Would you have reacted the way Olivia did? Let's discuss in the comments below. If you believe in justice, fairness, and holding people accountable, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more powerful real-life stories. Because respect isn't about money, power, or status. It's about how you treat people. Thank you for watching. Stay aware, stay strong, and always stand up for what's right.